Shabbos Kestenbaum is a self-described Jewish American activist. He came to public prominence earlier this year as one of the leading voices accusing Harvard, the school he attends, and other Ivy League universities of being pervasively anti-Semitic and failing to protect Jewish students. In July, he delivered a primetime address at the Republican National Convention announcing that he was supporting Donald Trump based on many of those issues. And he is also now a plaintiff suing Harvard in a lawsuit brought in a federal court in Massachusetts, alleging that Harvard, quote, has become a bastion of rampant anti-Jewish hatred and harassment, and that college administrators failed to fulfill their duty of care to keep Jewish students safe. And we are very happy to have him here to discuss all of this and more. Shabbos, good evening. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming on. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
So let me start with the lawsuit that you brought in January of this year against Harvard. It's a pretty long complaint, and there's a lot of grievances that are expressed about things going on at the Harvard campus that you think are bad or inappropriate, but it is a lawsuit as well, and therefore the allegation has to be that Harvard had a legal obligation to take certain steps to protect Jewish students or combat anti-Semitism that it failed to take. Can you just identify, say, 2 or 3 of the measures that you believe Harvard administrators had an obligation to take that they failed to take?
Happily. So I'll give you one quick anecdote. There was a staff member who challenged me to debate him as to whether Jews were behind 9/11. That was after he had vandalized all of our hostage posters that we received permission to post, where he said that Jews did 9/11, that Jews are friends with Jeffrey Epstein. On Kfir Bibas, who's the now 2-year-old baby being held hostage in Gaza, he had written, "His head is still on, where's the evidence?" So I, of course, don't respond to that email. A couple hours later, he's posting on his social media a video of him waving a machete with a couple of screenshots saying that he has a plan to take down the Zionist mafia. He wants to fight. A month later, he says that he has a posse that's coming after more than blood. So I frantically email, I frantically call, I request to meet with really anyone at Harvard, because you have to remember, this is a staff member. He knew where I lived because of the Harvard directory. He had access to campus. So I asked Harvard, what are you going to do to discipline this professor? And more fundamentally, make sure that he can't harm me or other Jewish students. To this day, Harvard has not responded to a single one of my emails or my phone calls. That's pretty deliberately indifferent. And I can't imagine that any other minority group would be treated with the contempt, the disregard, and the disdain that Harvard treats its Jewish students. And, I'll give you one last quick example, but again, we could delve more into it later. Harvard was ranked by the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expressions 248th out of 248 universities when it came to free speech. They routinely rescind controversial speakers. They actually unaccepted 12 students who had posted sexist memes in a WhatsApp group. And when a noted anti-Semite, Muhammad El-Kurd, was invited, for the very first time, Harvard said, well, he has a First Amendment right and we want to engage in controversial ideas. Well, that's fine if that's how Harvard always played the game, but they've never played the game that way. So, deliberate indifference and creating a double standard when it comes to Jewish students.
So let's start with that first point. I realize, obviously, that speech is offensive to a lot of people to say that, we want to raise a knife against the Zionist state, which is the Israeli government, obviously reacting to the bombing of Gaza on October 7th. But in general, the idea of academia and college campuses and professors and tenure and academic freedom is to be able to express any and all views, where that's the one place where there's not supposed to be a prohibited idea or thought, where everything is permitted to be questioned and nothing is taboo. Do you think that Harvard in this case should have but failed to, say, discipline or fire that staff member because of the expression of those ideas that you dislike?
Yeah, so I'm totally with you, Glenn. The Carl Sagan line of the cure for fallacious argument is a better argument, not the suppression of ideas. I'm totally in favor of a university and a culture that really values free speech, the intellectual discourse, and the academic rigor. The problem is Harvard University has never really cared about that. So if they want to play the game like the University of Chicago, that all speech is protected and you can really invite anyone you want, then fine, I really wouldn't have a problem. The problem is Harvard has never played that game. As I just said, they routinely disinvite speakers who are deemed transphobic, speakers who are deemed controversial, yet the only acceptance seems to be with Jewish students. And my I wouldn't say offense. My problem with that staff member was not that he challenged me to debate him as to whether Jews were behind 9/11. My problem is he filmed a video taunting me with a machete, saying he's coming after for more than blood. I mean, that's a threat. We have to file a police report. So
wait, did he send that video only to you? He emailed the video only to you of him holding up a knife?
No, so he had emailed me earlier asking me to debate him in a secluded underpass. I don't respond. And then he had posted a video later that night with a machete. And then about a month later, he tags me on Twitter saying that, yes, he's coming for more than blood and he has a posse, something to that effect. Oh, and he's going to bury me in the ground. So, that's not appropriate behavior of any staff member. But again, I agree with you when it comes to speech. I do think speech should be protected, but that's really not what our lawsuit is about. Our lawsuit is about, hey, look, we weren't able to access our library because it was surrounded by masked protesters. We weren't able to access certain areas in campus because during the encampment, there was a sign that said, make sure to talk to us before you're allowed in. These students have no control over whether students can go or not, yet they were able to do that for 3 weeks. So I think you and I can probably agree that has nothing to do with speech. That has to do with the actions and the behavior of students that Harvard allowed to materialize for weeks on end. So
you're saying we're all. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt. I thought you were done.
So the bottom line is, I think, with each other when it comes to speech. However, most of our lawsuit, it's not about speech. It's about a double standard. It's about the violation of policies that Harvard refused to discipline students on. And in fact, the House Committee on Education and the Workforce just detailed yesterday how Harvard did not discipline any of the students who violated Harvard policy. But that's entirely separate from free speech, which, again, we would agree should be protected.
So when you turned over that email to law enforcement authorities, did they take any action? Did they arrest that staff member? Did they conclude that he had violated the criminal law?
Sure. So the police told me to file a restraining order, which I did not do simply because I didn't want to, drown myself down in the technical bureaucratic details. I had better things to do. However, it was very clear that he'd violated Harvard's internal policies as it pertains to bullying, intimidation, and harassment. So every time I emailed or called Harvard University about this particular individual, they never once responded. I mean, that's pretty odd.
So you had mentioned the group fire.org, of which I'm actually a big fan, and at the same time you were essentially saying there's a double standard because when it comes to free speech, Harvard will basically prohibit anybody from coming to campus that offends any minority group except for Jews. Now, one of the things that FIRE has been very vocal on since October 7th is denouncing all kinds of political figures, governors, academic administrators for their, for example, decrees shutting down pro-Palestinian groups, Students for Justice in Palestine, banning particularly incendiary pro-Palestinian speakers. Does that, that seems to me to kind of cut against your argument that the only types of students who are ever subjected to these double standards are Jewish students, because in those cases, banning those groups are about protecting Jewish students from hearing opinions that they dislike. Is that something you're comfortable with, that you've objected to?
Yeah, so I can talk about Harvard specifically. Harvard, after about a year or so, they banned the Palestine Solidarity Committee temporarily. They reinstated them about a month ago. The reason they banned them had nothing to do with the speakers they were inviting. In fact, today at Harvard University, there was an event on a convicted Palestinian terrorist who killed a 25-year-old Jewish person, and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies is having that event as we speak. Or actually, I think they just had an hour ago. The reason the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee was temporarily banned, and again, they were reinstated, is because they kept violating the time, place, and manner restrictions. So you can protest. You can, and not only can, but you should do that. I 100%, let's make no distinction about this, I 100% people who disagree with me, people who have controversial opinions, they should be able to protest. However, you can't interrupt the classroom, right? And that's what the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee was doing. You can protest, but you can't block the entrance to the library, which is what the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee was doing. So every university has their own internal policies on what's considered appropriate and inappropriate protesting. And the Harvard Palestine Solidarity Committee, in addition with other groups like Harvard Out of Occupied Palestine, Harvard Jews for Palestine, the list goes on, they just kept violating time, place, and manner restrictions. And the best example, of course, is the encampment. So you can protest, but what you can't do, and this is what happened to me, is you can't follow people on their way to class. You can't record them with their phones. And I had former classmates, former friends who would don these bright yellow safety vests, and they would quite literally follow me to class. And I would ask them what they were doing, and they wouldn't respond to me. And this happened for 3 weeks on end. So the reason they were temporarily banned was not to do with free speech. It had to do with their inappropriate behavior and the violation of internal policies. But absolutely, you have a right to be anti-Semitic. You have a right to chant controversial slogans.
Like Death to Israel, or globalize the Intifada. Are those all permissible free speech expressions in your view?
So when it comes to the public square, I think, yes, the problem is Harvard has internal policies and they've routinely criticized speech in the past. So Harvard is the one that needs to make this distinction. Harvard needs to be the one to say either all speech is prohibited or all speech is permitted. What they can't do is say there is controversial speech that we're going to protect, but if it's controversial speech that targets Jewish students, yeah, that's fine. It's the double standard, Glenn. That's
okay,
what we're
I get that.
about.
So on that question of the double standard, your lawsuit doesn't just talk about Harvard, it talks about Ivy League schools in general. I've heard you in interviews and speeches talking about American academia, American academic institutions in general. So you're right. The students for Justice in Palestine were temporarily banned or suspended by Harvard, but at a lot of other schools around the country since October 7th, they were just shut down. Ron DeSantis, for example, ordered every Student for Justice in Palestine group shut down and banned from every campus. That's something Fire objected to. Columbia actually did the same. So in terms of the double standards, while there's all these bannings and suspensions of pro-Palestinian groups, are you aware of any pro-Israel group that has been suspended or disciplined or punished in any way on American campuses since October 7th?
Sure. I mean, I'll answer the question with a question. Are you aware of any pro-Israel group that has called for the ethnic genocide of Muslims, that have blocked the entrances of libraries, that have protested inside of classrooms, that have disrupted classrooms, that have targeted the Muslim Student Association with swastikas? The answer is no, of course not. So in terms of the specifics, again, I'd rather focus on Harvard, but Ron DeSantis, for example, when he shut down Students for Justice in Palestine, he was citing a lawsuit that NJAC, the National Jewish Advocacy Center, I think that's the acronym, that they filed against Students for Justice in Palestine and a litany of other groups because they receive a lot of their funding from this dark outside money, including Qatar. And in the case of Code Pink, they actually get a lot of their money from the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that's what he was citing. In terms of Columbia, I think it's pretty obvious why Columbia shut down their Students for Justice in Palestine. And that's because a significant amount of their members took part in the occupation of Hamilton Hall. They took a maintenance worker hostage. They vandalized private property and they refused to leave. So again, I'm all for using free speech and exercising your First Amendment rights, but not when it comes to vandalizing property, not when it comes to threatening or harming other students physically. And I'll just close by saying this. I'm in Pittsburgh today. I met with students at the University of Pittsburgh. As I was talking to the students, there was a university-wide alert saying that there was a physical assault against a Jewish student last night where anti-Semitic threats were being yelled at as well. This is the third physical assault against a Jewish student at the University of Pittsburgh this month alone. I mean, whether this was an African-American student, a Jewish student, an LGBTQ plus student, these threats can never be tolerated on our college campuses.
But I guess just in terms of the argument that you just made about why pro-Palestinian groups are banned, you're essentially saying, well, pro-Palestinian groups are banned all over the country because they were actually violating the rules, whereas pro-Israel groups were never suspended because they didn't violate the rules. That sounds to me like a defense that you're making, that college campuses and college administrators are actually applying the laws equally by banning pro-Palestinian groups when they violate the law and treating pro-Israel groups exactly the same way. So it seems like I guess what I'm saying is it's very hard to understand how you can claim that only Jews are not given these protections, only Jews are treated in these derogatory ways, when if you look at the last year, by your own argument, you're basically saying, yeah, there were tons of Palestinian groups that were banned, but they deserved it, and no pro-Israel groups are banned because they didn't. I mean, isn't that exactly what you would want, assuming all those facts that you asserted are true?
Yeah, well, no, I think you're lumping two things together. One is I'm talking about the double standard at Harvard University, and then broadly speaking, I would agree. The University of Miami, the University of Florida, they've never had a double standard. I very much encourage the American people to look at those universities because they really are about the free exchange of ideas, and they're not really into the political indoctrination.
No, but I'm saying at Harvard, comparing the treatment of the pro-Palestinian group that was temporarily suspended to the pro-Israel groups that never were, it sounds to me like you're arguing that those rules were applied justly. They were applied justly to the pro-Palestinian group and to the pro-Israel group.
No, not at all. I mean, I encourage all your viewers to read our lawsuit in full. Yes, it is true. I give Harvard credit for temporarily suspending the group, but then again, they unsuspended them, and they just had an unsanctioned protest literally yesterday where they again surrounded the entrance to the library. However, if you want to talk about a double standard, forget about the Muhammad El-Kurd when they invited that controversial speaker, which is the example I gave earlier. We could talk about the encampments. You had hundreds of students and professors who set up illegal encampments on Harvard property. they violated all time, place, and manner restrictions in clear violation of Harvard policy, and only 13 students were suspended, and as of a month ago, 13 of the 13 had their suspensions revoked. Not only that, in exchange for the encampment leaders leaving, the president of the university, Alan Garber, told them, you will be able to meet with the Harvard Management Corporation, which oversees Harvard's $50 billion endowment, to talk about divestment from Israel. You will be able to meet with Harvard senior faculty members to talk about the establishment of a Palestinian Study Center. Well, I've been asking for a meeting with Alan Garber and senior administrators for months, and they never once responded to any of my emails. So how come if you violate the law, if you follow Jews on their way to class, if you set up encampments throughout the campus, you'll have your voices heard, but if you play by the rules, you won't have your voices heard? So that's just one example, I would say, of a pretty obvious double standard. But as I said, I'm happy to give more examples.
How was your voice suppressed or silenced, or fellow pro-Israel groups? How are your voices suppressed? Or sounds like, I mean, from what I see, you're all over the media. You've had a ton of platforms to be heard, both at Harvard and more broadly in the U.S. media. How has your voice or the voice of pro-Israel advocates been silenced or censored?
Well, to be clear, in this 15-minute interview, I never used the word suppressed or silenced. I don't think I am being suppressed or silenced by the national media, evident by the fact that I'm on the national media. I'm talking about a double standard. I never said we're being suppressed. I never said we're being silenced. I said we are treated categorically different. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. We had the president of Harvard University say under oath on live TV in front of Congress that you could call for the genocide of Jewish people depending on the right context, when we know that that would never be tolerated if it was a different minority group. And the best case of that is just last year, there was a homophobic incident, and the university immediately that day, I don't remember if they expelled, but they certainly suspended the student and then released a university-wide email. When, when George Floyd was killed, the university released a statement almost immediately saying that as an institution, they would rid themselves of white supremacy and racism, which I think is a good thing to say. The problem was, after October 7th, they didn't really say much. It took them 4 days, and they couldn't really condemn the 34 student groups who blamed the Israeli regime for all the ongoing violence in the Middle East. After Russia invaded Ukraine, Harvard immediately fly the Ukrainian flag. After October 7th, when we asked, can you fly the Israeli flag, they said no. So, that's a double standard. But again, I never used the words suppressed or silenced. I'm very privileged and fortunate that I have a voice with the national media.
Speaking of the encampments that you've mentioned a couple times now, one of the things you said in your RNC speech was, quote, I was harassed merely for being a Jew. Were these encampments closed to all Jewish students, or were there Jewish students participating in those encampments and even helping to organize them and participating in their duration?
Sure. So I think you and I would probably agree that an African American saying that the Confederacy wasn't racist is probably wrong. So to a Jewish student participating in the encampments, yeah, they can do it, but that doesn't make it any less anti-Semitic. So it is true that there were many Jews who participated in the encampments, in the same way that there are some African Americans who believe in the Confederacy, in the same way that throughout Jewish history, there is what's called the Erev Rav, which is literally translated as the mixed multitude. We have a history of Jews within the Jewish community who have not, I would say, endorsed Jewish values. The best example I would probably give was in Nazi Germany, when you had the National Association of German Jewry, which was the Jewish division of the Nazi Party. So I get the question you're trying to arrive at, which is, look, the encampments can't be anti-Semitic if you have Jews doing it. But at the end of the day, when you're calling for the violent destruction of the Jewish state, that is anti-Semitic. And when I talk about being harassed, yes, I did not initiate any type of conversation with the encampment protesters. I did not try to initiate, God forbid, any type of violence. I was simply walking through it. And I encourage all of your listeners, go on my Twitter. You can see the videos for yourselves. Every single time I walked through the encampment, which is on my way to class, which is on the way to prayers, every single time there would be at least 3 or 4 safety marshals, these students who would don these bright yellow vests, and they would just follow me, and they would record me with their phones. And in some cases, the National Lawyers Guild on the last week of the encampments would come, and they would write down what I was doing on their notepads. I mean, that's inexcusable, and that's unacceptable. And even though you and I, Glenn, probably disagree on a lot of politics, we can both agree that no student should be targeted simply for going to class.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that there have been a lot of attempts to suggest that these encampments are hostile toward Jewish students, that they impede the flow of people simply because they're Jews. As you put it, I was harassed merely for being a Jew. But isn't the real distinction at these encampments not who's Jewish and who's not? I mean, the Columbia one was often held up as the most anti-Semitic one, and they were actually having Jewish ceremonies and Shabbat dinners within the encampment. It seemed to me like the difference, and I've interviewed a lot of Harvard students and Columbia students students and others participating in these groups, many of whom were Jewish, the distinction was not who's a Jew and who isn't a Jew. The distinction was who supports the Israeli bombing of Gaza and who doesn't.
Sure. So again, I think I answered that pretty well in the last answer, which is, yes, there was a tokenization, of course. I remember back when I was voting for people like Jamal Bowman and AOC, they would say tokenization is racism. And the tokenization of Jewish people, it's nothing new. As I said, there was a Jewish division of the Nazi Party. Some of the most vehemently anti-Semitic communists under the Soviet Union were Jews. So yes, it's an unfortunate part of our history, but I was not going around Harvard University saying, let's kill Gazan civilians. I was going around Harvard University going to class, and I was followed as a result.
But you have spoken out in favor of the Israeli war in Gaza, right? That is a position that you had publicly expressed, that you publicly expressed before, that you support what Israel is doing in Gaza against Hamas?
So before I answer that question, I guess I'll answer it with a question, which is, even if I did say that, are you saying it's acceptable to be followed for one's political
I'm saying that it would be
alignments?
inaccurate to say that the distinction that the encampment was drawing or that the protesters were drawing is simply harassing people who are merely Jews, given that there are many Jews who are inside those encampments, not a few token ones, but actually a large number of young American Jews are very opposed to what the Israelis are doing in Gaza and elsewhere. So the distinction that I'm seeing, both in the reporting I've done, the interviews I've done, and even based on what you're describing, is not between preventing people from entering the encampment based on who is a Jew or who isn't, meaning keep all Jews out, which would be anti-Semitic. The distinction is this is an encampment that is protesting the Israeli war in Gaza. If you agree with us, we want you to be part of our protest. And if you don't, whether you're a Jew or a Christian or even evangelical or an atheist, and you support the Israeli bombing of Gaza, that's where the opposition lies.
So, I mean, I understand what you're insinuating. You're trying to say, well, I was being followed for my political ideologies, which, again, isn't that much better. That's still against Harvard policy and still something that you should condemn regardless. But again, I'm not in support of Israel indiscriminately bombing Gazan children. Yeah, I'm in support of Israel defending themselves after October 7th. But the reason I was targeted, and again, it wasn't just me, it was dozens of Harvard Jewish students and dozens of Harvard Jewish faculty. I'm not the only plaintiff in the lawsuit. There are 5 others. And again, your listeners should certainly read our lawsuit. They were being targeted because they were visibly Jewish. I mean, there's no other way around it.
Okay, let me ask you about your experience specifically.
Can I make one last point?
Of course, absolutely.
Can I make one last point?
Yeah, of course.
There are plenty of Harvard students who have been a lot more vocal about their support of Israel's campaign in Gaza, and they were not followed, and they were not Jewish. So I digress. But anyways,
before I was a journalist, I was a lawyer. I'm, I guess, a little bit ashamed to admit it. I like to forget about it, but I'm bringing it up here because it's relevant.
You're a recovering lawyer.
Yeah, exactly, a recovering lawyer. I did read your lawsuit in depth in preparation for talking to you. And in general, one of the things that happens when you bring a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit of the kind that you brought against Harvard on behalf of an individual, is that you have to say exactly not just what the defendants did wrong or illegally, but what the damages were to the plaintiff who's seeking money damages, as you are. You're seeking compensatory and punitive damages as part of this lawsuit. So I've heard what you've said about being harassed and those things, but I just want to make sure we're being very specific and very concrete and very clear. Were there any times when you were actually physically assaulted or physically injured by pro-Palestinian protesters on Harvard's campus?
So again, I understand what you're insinuating.
No, I'm honestly not insinuating anything. I'm really just trying to ask. I'm trying to just get a sense. I understand you've talked about things that you did that were done that you thought were wrong, following you around, taping you, all of that. But I'm just trying to get an understanding of what actually happened to you. And so my question is not really insinuating anything. It's really just asking, were you physically assaulted or physically injured in any way by pro-Palestinian students at any point during these protests?
There were physical assaults against Jewish students at Harvard University. I encourage your listeners to read the lawsuit. Me personally, no. Instead, I had private armed security outside my house for a week after a Harvard staff member taunted me with a machete. I've received countless death threats, both online and mailed to me. So yeah, there were definitely instances where me being a Jewish student, and really any student, were experiencing things that should never really be experienced as a result of being a student at a university and having certain religious ideologies. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, while it is true that I personally was not physically assaulted, thank God, and unfortunately that is not the case of Harvard University, that's also not the case of the many, many experiences of Jewish students across the country. Just as I said, just today there was a physical assault at University of Pittsburgh. There were 3 physical assaults at the University of Michigan in the last couple of weeks. So unfortunately, this is happening a lot more often than is being reported.
Well, I just want to point you to a couple of studies that were done exactly on this question, pretty recent ones. One was a study from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data from May of 2024, and the title was Demonstrations Related to the Israel-Palestine Conflict in the United States, and it said, quote, while some notable violent clashes have recently taken place, such as on the UCLA campus, where pro-Israel supporters actually initiated that violence, that was the one example they had, the overwhelming majority of student protests since October 7th, in fact, 99%, have remained peaceful. And then the Harvard Kennedy School issued a report as well entitled Crowd Counting Consortium, an empirical overview of recent pro-Palestine protests at U.S. schools. It said only a few dozen of these thousands of protest days have seen even property damage or injuries to police or counter-protesters. Despite that fact, many public figures continue to describe the protest as violent, and police have arrested more than 3,600 protesters. Our data also shows that protest participants have been injured by police or counter-protesters, sometimes severely, about as often as protesters have caused property damage, much of which has been limited to graffiti. So it's analyzing essentially every campus protest in the name of the pro-Palestinian cause or the anti-war cause that has taken place since October 7th. And it's essentially saying there are very, very few instances of physical confrontation or violence that has taken place. And the one that was really entailing that was the one at UCLA, which pro-Israel activists from off campus came and initiated. Do you have data that contradicts this, or are you just talking anecdotally about things you've been hearing?
Well, again, I think that's a pretty loaded question. First of all, with UCLA in particular, that was in response to a Jewish student who was assaulted the week before. But yes, if you want to talk about statistics, absolutely. The National Association of the National Jewish Advocacy Center showed that physical assaults on Jewish people were up 45%, vandalizing incidents were up 65%, harassment was up 164%. If you look at the overwhelming majority of religiously based hate crimes, the overwhelming majority are Jewish people. If you want to look at Columbia University, where maintenance workers were taken hostage, if you want to look at Harvard University, where there was a physical assault at Harvard Business School, if you want to look at the University of Michigan, where 2 Jewish students were attacked with a glass bottle. So yeah, I would have loved to have read this report earlier, which is why I asked your staff if there's anything they needed me to know beforehand. But even if we were to take what that report is, and I haven't heard of that organization before, even if we were to take what they were saying at face value, it does not in any way take away from the actual lived experiences of Jewish students who've been physically attacked and physically assaulted on their campuses. So I'm happy, if you want to send that over, I'm happy to read that study in more depth. But again, I can point to the FBI statistics that have shown that rates of anti-Semitism, and we're not talking about anything verbal or hate speech, we're talking about like physical assaults, they have skyrocketed since the October 7th attacks here in the United States.
Just to be clear, there were 2 studies, one of which came from the Harvard Kennedy School, the other which was very widely publicized in almost every major media. Let me just
let me just add to that real quick. Can I add to that real quick?
Yeah.
I would just add that the Harvard Kennedy School employs someone by the name of Marshall Gans. Marshall Gans was found to have discriminated against Jewish students, not just through Harvard Kennedy's own internal investigation, but also by the Brandeis Center. He's still employed. So I wouldn't exactly take Harvard Kennedy School at their word.
So you feel the data might have been fabricated or just invented, or?
Well, again, that's why I asked your staff if they could send me anything. So if you were going to pull things out, I'd be able to read it before. But I would say again, just talk to Jewish students. Talk to my friend Hannah from UC Berkeley, who had a rock thrown through her dorm window with a note saying "F Jews." Talk to my friend Eden at Columbia, who was stalked to her dorm room one night because she was wearing a Star of David. Talk to Eli Civis, who he went a little viral at UCLA. He was prevented from going to class because there were people who were preventing him from the encampment. You can talk to Talia I shouldn't say her last name. You should talk to Talia at MIT, who had also a physical incident. So I would encourage you to amplify the voices of Jewish students who've been saying for months now that they are under physical assault. And again, we are total in agreement here, Glenn, that peaceful protest is great, and it's great to hear that so many of these protests were in fact peaceful, but I would be very skeptical of the data that would show 99% were peaceful. I mean, just last night in New York City, which is where I live, the NYPD had to arrest dozens of people after they were smashing glass windows, after they were vandalizing. Even when Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu was speaking, they were burning American flags, they were desecrating World War II monuments. So I'd be pretty skeptical on any study that would suggest that 99% of all these protests were peaceful.
Yeah, no, to be clear, I don't think that like burning flags or even vandalizing a building is typically regarded as violence. Violence is the physical injuring of other human beings. I think that's what the study was trying to take a look at. Now,
but let
me just ask the next question, and then you can respond however you want, including by adding on another point. You're citing hate speech reporting, self-reporting by American Jews who are reporting in larger numbers what they claim to be incidents of anti-Semitism. That's the hate speech. The hate crimes increase that you're referring to are self-reporting by American Jews. In the same time, say during the last 2 years or 3 years, those same statistics show a very significant increase in reported anti-Black racism, anti-transphobic racism, violence, anti-immigrant violence, anti-Muslim bigotry. Do you see essentially all of these groups as suffering similar forms of bigotry, or do you feel like the group to which you belong has a kind of special or elevated danger that it faces in the United States?
Sure. So again, I have to reject the premise of the question. The Federal Bureau of Investigations, the FBI, is not an organization of Jews self-reporting. And the FBI, again, your listeners can all Google this. The FBI released their statistics on hate crimes on September 23rd or September 24th, and it found that Jewish hate crimes increased by 63%. And again, this is not speech. This has nothing to do with verbal assaults. This has to do with physical attacks. It increased by 63%. Even though Jews make up 2% of the U.S. population, the fact that Jews are the overwhelming victims of hate crimes really points to the fact that, yes, what is happening to Jewish Americans is quantitatively and qualitatively different than what's happening to other Americans. And look, I remember marching with Black Lives Matter. I was very proud to do so. And I remember when people would tell me, well, it's true, Black Lives Matter, but all lives matter. I would get very upset because, yeah, it's true, all lives matter. But right now the focus is on Black lives because they're the ones who are experiencing systemic oppression. They're the ones who are telling us that they're not safe. And I find it really odd that when it comes to anti-Semitism, a lot of reporters, and I don't want to say such as yourself because, I have no reason to think you're acting in any way that isn't honest, and, I'm a fan of yours. But I would say I do find it a little odd that reporters and certain politicians, they'll try to equate the Jewish experience to all forms of bigotry and hatred. The Senate Judiciary Committee finally had a hearing on hate crimes, and it was really meant to be a hearing on anti-Semitism, but it turned into this all lives matter spectacle. And I think that really points to what we're Jewish Americans are talking about, which is a double standard. How come during Black Lives Matter you didn't have politicians condemning transphobia and sexism? Because, yeah, those are bad things, but right now the focus is on Black lives. Yet when it comes to anti-Semitism, all of a sudden all lives matter the issue. So again, this is not Jews self-reporting instances of feeling uncomfortable. This is the FBI's own data. They found that close to 12,000 religiously motivated hate crimes were committed in the last year alone. The overwhelming victims were Jewish.
What I guess what I'm getting at is I feel like, all human beings are tribalistic. We evolved that way. We have to be part of a tribe for thousands of years in order to survive. We see the world through our own tribalistic lens. We typically see the world through our subjectivity. Do you ever question whether or not the reason you think that at the moment the most endangered or the most marginalized group or the focus of all the hatred is the particular group with which you identify, that maybe the reason for that is because you're looking at things tribalistically? In other words, I identify primarily as a Jew, and I'm here to say that my group, Jewish people, are uniquely or particularly endangered right now in the United States as compared to other minority groups, including Black people and trans people and Muslim people and immigrants.
Well, again, it's an interesting question, but I would answer it by saying if that's true, that I'm primarily motivated by tribalism, then how come I was protesting with Black Lives Matter? How come I was marching when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade? I mean, I'm not a woman and I'm not Black, but I was particularly concerned about women and African Americans during those two time periods because they were the ones who were overwhelmingly being oppressed and being cut out of a system. So too, when it comes to anti-Semitism, I think, yeah, the focus right now is on anti-Semitism, is on the Jewish people, not because I'm tribalistic, just because the data doesn't lie, Glenn. I mean, look at the FBI statistics. Look at the Department of Justice. Look at the Department of Education. They overwhelmingly corroborate
but what has happened to hate crimes to other groups in the last few years? What has happened to hate crime, the rate of hate crimes with these other groups? Have they declined? Have they stayed the same? Have they increased? Do you know?
No, correct. Hate crimes overall have gone up, and the overwhelming majority of those hate crime victims are Jewish people. We count for roughly 2/3. So while it is true that anti-Black racism, while it is true that misogyny, while it is true that transphobia are problems, and again, that is why I proudly marched with Black Lives Matter. That's why I will continue to stand up for people who are being the victims of oppression. I would simply ask that just like we marched with them and we showed concern, genuine concern for them, that they should show genuine concern for us. And I don't think that's asking too much. I'm not, God forbid, it, trying to suppress the freedom of other peoples. I'm simply saying we should protect all Americans, and right now the issue is Jewish Americans. And by the way, if it was Muslim Americans who were being disproportionately targeted, if they were 2/3 of all religiously motivated hate crimes, I would stand up with my Muslim brothers and sisters. The reality is, while it is true, acts of Islamophobia, acts of transphobia, acts of racism are happening, they are not happening at the same rate as anti-Semitism.
No, but I just want to I want to understand the claim you're making, because I heard you at first be saying that more than half of all hate crimes are against Jewish people in the United States, even though it's only 2% of the population. And then at the end, you sort of amended that to say the majority of religiously motivated crimes, which obviously wouldn't count anti-black racism, attacks on immigrants, You're saying that the majority of hate crimes in the United States, the majority, more than 50%, are directed at American Jews and black people and LGBTs and Muslims and immigrants and women, gender-motivated violence against women constitute a minority, all those together?
No, so let me be clear. Thank you for correcting that. 68% of all religiously motivated hate crimes, according to the FBI, that were conducted in 2023, the targets were Jewish people. In terms of hate crimes more broadly speaking, we know that Jewish people are disproportionately targeted for hate crimes. They are disproportionately more affected than other minority groups. Again, that does not take away from the real plight that other minority groups experience, which is why I'm very proud of my activism on behalf of other minority groups. But again, the issue right now, I would argue, because the data supports it, is certainly anti-Semitism.
Your group, the hostility against your group is the issue right now. That's what your argument is?
If you can point to transgender individuals who are not being allowed access to their libraries on campus, then I will gladly come back on this program and I will denounce that, and I will stand with my trans allies. However, if you look at Harvard University, if you look at Columbia, if you look at UCLA, if you look at University of Michigan, I mean, the list goes on, we have seen Jewish people who are being denied the ability to learn in the library because it is being surrounded. So again, I don't think it's an either or. I don't think we can only focus on anti-Semitism and shut out all other hate crimes. But I do think we have to be a little realistic, which is when you look at the statistics, again, this is not a he said, she said, this is not a subjective policy or subjective narrative. The statistics bear out that objectively, Jews in the 21st century, and explicitly and specifically after October 7th, have been the victims of religiously motivated hate crimes.
So let's look at Harvard, which you've been encouraging us to do specifically, and statistics as well. And I just want to cite a couple of statistics regarding Harvard. Over the last 25 years, Harvard has had a total of 5 presidents. One of them lasted about 11 months, Claudine Gay. Of the 4 other presidents, 3 of them were Jewish. So 3 of the last 5 presidents at Harvard, the people who ran the school, the top official, 3 out of the 5 of them were Jewish. More than 50%, even though, as you point out, Jews are only 2% of the American population. For decades now, Jews have been wildly overrepresented at elite universities like Harvard in terms of their population in the United States. And even now, even as it's declined for a variety of reasons, it's still the case that the percentage of the Harvard student population is 10%, or 4 to 5 times the percentage of Jews in terms of the overall population. And by the way, although 3 out of the 5 Harvard presidents of the last 25 years were Jewish, the 4th one, though she wasn't Jewish, she was married to a Jewish Harvard professor who's a renowned historian of medicine, Harvey Rosenberg. Is it really possible to depict a institution that continuously empowers at the highest level a massively disproportionate number of Jews to run the institution, whose student body is overwhelmingly filled with a lot of Jewish students as compared to their percentage of their population? Is that institution really plausibly a bastion of Jew hatred or anti-Semitic?
Yeah, I think I get asked this question a lot. I think the answer is actually really simple. Glenn, you and I would probably agree that there is systemic racism, or African Americans are in some level or another being disadvantaged by our political system. Yet what I, God forbid, tell an African American in 2012, what are you talking about? The President of the United States is black. The Attorney General, Eric Holder, is black. No. Because while it is true, there are exceptions, and I'm very proud of the fact that Jewish people disproportionately have excelled in technological advancements, in medical breakthroughs, in academia.
In media, in business, in Silicon Valley, in politics, in academic institutions like Harvard, pretty much every sector of American life, Jews have and continue to thrive. Even though that's true, what is your conclusion?
Yeah, as I was saying, 100 years ago, the population of Jewish students at Harvard University was 25%. Today, it's 4%. It's not because Jews got dumber over time. It's because Jews have been cracked down, and there's been a systemic campaign to crack down on the amount of Jews at the university. Again, the numbers don't lie. The statistics don't lie. So in the same way that you can't look at disproportionate amounts of Jews being successful because Jews are successful, we invest a lot in our education. We invest a lot in our communities. We invest a lot in our values. We're family-oriented, and I would encourage any community to take a look at what the Jewish community is doing and probably reciprocate or replicate what that is all about. In fact, that's why you have so many Asian Americans typically who go to Israel. When I was studying in yeshiva at Aish Torah, we often would have Christian groups from Korea, from Japan, some cases from China, who would come to our yeshiva and study the Talmud with us because they wanted to understand what is it about Jewish success. So I think two things can be true at the same time. I think Jews can be successful because that's the way we're geared, because we very much value education. We very much value the family structure. And at the same time, it is so remarkable that we're so successful given the systemic and pervasive nature of anti-Semitism, like the fact that our rates of being students at Harvard has plummeted at Harvard University and at universities across the level. So I don't think the question is, well, how can there be anti-Semitism if Jews are so successful? I think we should ask it the opposite way, which is, wow, Jews are so successful even though there's anti-Semitism.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people did view the election of Barack Obama as a pretty strong symbol of how much progress America had made based on race. And I think if you were to have a country like the United States where 3 of the last 5 American presidents elected by the American people were all black, and the 4th one was married to a black person, and black people filled the highest ranks of government overwhelmingly, disproportionately to their numbers, I think you would start to have an argument that would say it's kind of difficult to continue to maintain that the United States is a systematically racist country in light of those statistics. Let me just ask you one question. There's been a few times in your answers where you have kind of suggested that, say, Jewish people participating in anti-war protests or in encampments against the Israeli war in Gaza are tokens because they're betraying Jewish values. Jewish values was a phrase you used in your RNC speech where you said essentially Jewish values are American values are Jewish values. After that speech, there were a lot of articles from a lot of Jewish people pretty vehemently objecting to what they heard you to be saying, that you are the spokesperson for what Jewish values are, that you are a spokesperson on behalf of American Jewry. There was an article in the Jewish journal Forward that said, I'm a Jew studying at Harvard Divinity School. Shabbos Kestenbaum does not speak for me. There was an article from a rabbi in the Jewish journal The Forward as well, arguing that you distorted, quote, what you call Jewish values. Do you feel like, in what you're saying, and you told me earlier, go talk to Jews. I've had a lot of Jews on my show about this issue on both sides. Do you feel like when you're articulating these views, you are speaking for the vast majority of American Jews, kind of like as a spokesman, or do you feel like you're speaking only for yourself?
Sure. So let's be clear. One of the criticisms I often get is that I'm the self-declared spokesman of the Jewish people. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm actually glad you mentioned that article in Forward because it was written, I won't say his name, but it was written by a former classmate of mine who was literally a student leader at the encampment who was calling for an intifada. So yeah, obviously I don't speak for him. I would never want to speak for someone like him. Same thing with that rabbi who you mentioned. This is someone who has never met me, as someone who made baseless accusations in that article. So no, I certainly don't speak for those 2 individuals, and I certainly would not want to speak to those 2 individuals. What I can say, again, is I'm kind of a numbers guy. The data shows that the overwhelming majority of Jewish people consider themselves to be Zionists. And in fact, I'm a religious Jew, which is why I have to hop off soon for the Sabbath. As a religious Jew, I pray 3 times a day. You know the direction I face when I pray 3 times a day? I face Jerusalem. You know what I have been saying in my prayers every single day since the day I was born? In addition to the fact that for 3,000 years, Jews have been saying these things, the return to Zion, the centrality of the land of Israel to our lives. In fact, we just had the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which is the saddest day of the Jewish year. It's a day where we don't wear leather shoes, we don't eat, we don't drink, we refrain from marital relations. Why? Because on that day, 2,500 years ago, our first and second temple was destroyed in Jerusalem. In fact, of the 613 commandments, a third of them can no longer be fulfilled because they have to do with Jews living in the land of Israel. Not only that, there is a positive command from the Bible itself that you must live in the land of Israel. So yeah, it is certainly true that Jews who primarily are not educated, primarily Jews who've not been to Israel, primarily primarily Jews who could not read the Talmud if you asked them to because they have very little education. It's true, they don't subscribe to those values, and that's their choice. But just like a vegetarian can't say, I'm a vegetarian even though I don't eat, excuse me, I'm a vegetarian even though I eat meat, so too, you can't say that I'm Jewish, but we have no connection to the land of Israel. We are literally called Jews because we come from Judea. We're the only minority group that are quite literally named after the place we are from. So living in Israel is a positive command. Jews have been living in the land of Israel uninterrupted for 3,000 years. So look, I appreciate you having me on. I really do. And I'm always happy to come back, Len. But I'm not a spokesman for the Jewish community. I have never once described myself in such ways. And I would also argue that if you look at Jewish history, we have always had detractors. We have always had Jews who do things that are not in our best interest. I mean, the best example, as I said earlier, the National Association of German Jewry, which was the Jewish division of the Nazi Party. And I would encourage all Jews, not just American Jews, but Jews across the world, to realize the centrality of the land of Israel, to stand up for Jewish Americans on college campuses, and yes, stand up for American values like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, because those very much are Jewish values.
All right, just one last question. I want to be super respectful of the time we said we're going to let you go. We have about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. So I just want to get this one last question in. Just in terms of who's a Jew and who isn't, who's speaking for most of the Jews and who aren't, you went to the RNC and you said, I'm voting Republican, I'm voting for Donald Trump because I think he's the one who's going to combat anti-Semitism and protect Israel. In part, that is absolutely what you said. Polls show that 3/4 of American Jews, 75%, intend to vote for the Democratic candidate. Only 1/4 of American Jews intend to vote the way you intend to vote, which is for Donald Trump. Doesn't on some level that indicate that you're speaking for a minority of American Jews, not even a majority?
Sure. So first of all, I did not endorse Trump at the Republican convention. You can watch my speech. I actually took pains not to endorse him. It's true, I did endorse him 2 months later after I'd gone to the Democratic National Convention and after I'd worked behind the scenes with Democratic policymakers to get them more in line with my values. But I took pains not to endorse Trump. And in fact, I ad-libbed a significant amount of my speech at the Republican convention not to endorse Trump. So I'm a Democrat. I've only voted for Democrats. I can understand why Jews vote for Democrats because typically they are more aligned with our values. I would say this, and again, I'm not a partisan. I'm happy to be swayed one way or the other, but we are all on the same page. Whether you're voting for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, Jewish Americans, broadly speaking, want the American hostages to be released from Gaza. They want a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, and they want to confront anti-Semitism on college campuses. If they think that Kamala Harris would be the best person for that job, go for it. I disagree. I think Donald Trump would be better for those concerns, even though I disagree with him on a whole bunch of other issues. I think he would be a lot better when it comes to issues that primarily affect the Jewish people. But again, I'm not a spokesman. I encourage every American Jew to make their own choices. I've been very clear why I'm supporting Trump. And if people disagree, that's fine, because we're all on the same page. We all want what's best, not just for Jewish Americans, but really for the American people. All
right. Well, I super appreciate your taking the time. It was a good, spirited discussion, which I always find revealing. And I hope you stay safe. And I wish you the best of luck. I'd be happy to talk to you again. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.